The pressure of recording gets everybody online. So, Pat, do you want me to facilitate as best I can, or would you like to try to do it from your phone?
I think probably, yeah, so sorry for this. Well, why don't you probably take the lead and I'll jump in as needed just because of connectivity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so morning, everyone. This is the July 13th meeting of the Biomass Task Group. We have a number of guests with us today to present and have a few things to get to before we do that. So thank you for everyone for being here. I know that the majority, except for folks who are still getting going this morning, of the task group members themselves have their cameras on. As we get going, perhaps for our visitors today, we could introduce who's a member of the task group and then who is the member of the public who's joined us today. Not introduce public, but just differentiate, I should say, between members of the task group and members of the public. I've put an agenda in the chat. I keep redropping it in for people who've joined after I had put it there. I'll put it there again. At the beginning of the agenda, there are minutes linked from our last meeting. We can check in on those in a second. I also linked in the agenda the follow-up that Jared Ulmer was gracious enough to put together for us, looking into the questions that folks had that were lingering after his presentation, and that of John Hinckley's from the consultant who works closely with DEC on evaluating the health impacts of the permits, or I should say the pollutant criterions, and how we issue the permits. And then finally, you'll see on the agenda largely today, we're joined by folks from Burlington Electric Department who manage Mcneil to talk with us about the district energy project for Mcneil, the history of it and why it hasn't been activated to date and what the possibilities of it are going forward. So let me start with the minutes. Always they're extremely brief, but if there's anything that was not captured, let me know. Otherwise, I'll take silence as an A-OK. Sounds good. I should say that hopefully we'll have some time after public comment at the end of the meeting just to talk about more thoughtfully than we've been able to because of time, sort of transition and where we're going for the next few meetings, because it would be helpful to have some input on that today. So why don't I shift before we go to the presentations and just, I'm sorry, my apologies that things are running behind a bit and how timely I am in getting things posted. But Jared Ulmer was gracious enough at the end of the day yesterday to follow up with answers to questions more specifically around the health impacts of the plants, and did some research looking at asthma rates and cancer rates in and around the plants. I can put a direct link if people don't have it, but if you click on the, give me 1 second, here it is. The last link there is a direct link to his email that I posted as a PDF online. The first response speaks to asthma rates and cancer rates in and around the Mcneil and Rygate plants. And then the second response tries to dive into the question at the end where comparisons were made about burning fossil fuels versus burning wood in our homes and the choices we have around that. So I just want to say, and folks should come if you haven't had a chance, knowing that I posted this late, I thought that his conclusions around asthma and cancer rates were very clear. And he did make a clear case that there's no scientific evidence or anything in the data that suggests asthma rates and or cancer rates are higher around the plants. In fact, in Chittenden County, those rates tend to be lower than the average. And then finally, I'll just say before going to conversation, his comments around burning fossil fuels and wood, I think were important to consider in that there are larger implications of burning fossil fuels that we should be considering and weighing as we're also weighing the health impacts of burning wood and in our homes for heat. So those were the takeaways that I got feel free to have a discussion. And if there's any other further follow-up, Jared has been more than welcome to continue to dive into the research and look at components of it for you. Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Some of you know that I am by profession an epidemiologist like Jared, so I particularly appreciated his fine presentation to this group and his diligence in looking for answers to the questions that have been raised. There are two comments I want to make. One is that, Jane, in your summary of his findings, you skipped over one that I think is important, which is that all the wood stoves for heat collectively are a much bigger health hazard than the wood-burning power plants. That's one piece that I think was just a strong comment of his. The other is that the studying cancer incidence rates around a point source of pollution, which is what we're talking about here, is really hard. And if there had been a signal, if there had been a bright spot for lung cancer in the vicinity of the Mcneil plant, that would have warranted further investigation. But the absence of a hot spot doesn't mean that there's not a problem. It's a relatively, the method that he used, which is quick and dirty, is relatively insensitive for detecting health impacts. And so cancers have long incubation periods, 10, 20, 30 years, and people are mobile. People move in and out of homes and neighborhoods. So people who happen to be living in a particular location when they develop lung cancer, they may have lived in 3 other places in the last 30 years. So to attribute their lung cancer to the place where they happen to be living when they get a diagnosis is a weak method for making attributions, causal attributions. That's less of an issue with asthma, where the incubation period is very short. If you're subject to asthma and you get exposed to a substance that triggers your asthma attack follows in a few minutes. It's that you don't have to wait 30 years to see what the health impact is. So the findings with respect to asthma are the negative findings are pretty robust. The negative findings with respect to lung cancer are not robust in that sense. So I just thought I'd bring that out for y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Those are really great points. Judy.
I can't find my button to raise my hand. So the ECO's Chittenden County Public Health and Community Design Data Analysis talks about particle matter. Do you know what the particle matter is coming from Mcneil? Does anybody know?
Yeah, Judy, this is Paul Pickman, Burlington Electric Department. I actually did pull that data. PM for calendar year 2020 was 3,251 pounds. PM for 2021 was 11,204 pounds. Q1 22 was 3,776 pounds.
Thank you. The reason I ask is because in the ECO's report, they say that the particle matter over 2.5 is most problematic, especially in the Old North End where Mcneil is. It causes increased emergency department visits, breathing problems, asthma symptoms get worse, adverse birth outcomes, decreased lung growth, lung cancer, and early death. So their report goes into a little bit different scenario.
This is Pat. So just one question. When you said PM, was that PM 10 or PM 2.5?
2.5.
And that was for the plant. That was that. Then the pounds you reported, was it just total particulate, or was that some micron measurement as well?
It says particle matter.
Okay.
Yeah, our analysis is PM10.
So, which is relevant to what I see from people who live there. If they have asthma, it gets worse.
Judy, perhaps is Jared familiar with the study that you're citing? It might be important for him to review that if it's not.
I mean, I don't know if he is or not, but I've been on the Ecos committee for probably a decade, and they're sending out these reports all the time. You can just find them online.
Can you say what the Eco Committee is?
Chittenden County Public Health and Community Design Data Analysis is what they call it. It stands for, I don't know, Environmental Community Opportunity Sustainability is what the acronym is.
Judy, that sounds like a county study. So maybe we can, if you have the link or just even the name, just.
Yeah, it is a county study. They've been working to try to address issues in that area. Because
And that just dropped the link in the chat too, which is helpful.
it's a highly impacted community. It's people of color who have been forced to live in the margins of town, which is right where Mcneil is. I mean, it would have been okay if we're talking the 1930s, because that's where all the stills were, but we're not talking that today. We're talking people and lives and schools and children.
Harley, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and I apologize if this was covered at the last meeting, which I missed, but in relation to particulate matter, can someone just briefly speak to how that's regulated in terms of levels being set by a regulatory body and kind of where BED is falling in relation to those regulations?
Alan, I don't know if you can remember the date and the numbers exactly, but Megan and John Hinckley did speak to that at the last meeting specifically, and it's in the permits that were linked and dropped in the website on the link from the last meeting, and BED and Rygate are both significantly below the regulatory numbers that EPA put out.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jane. I don't know that off the top of my head. I don't have a whole lot to do with the permitting process, so I would need to look that up as well.
Oh, wait, maybe.
Oh, sorry, Judy, go ahead. If you wanted to respond to that specifically, Judy, please do. Or Chase, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just curious about one point that was raised in Jared's follow-up, in which he referred to the efficiency of Mcneil and Rygate. And I was curious to know what numbers he was referring to about efficiency there. As the data I've seen on Mcneil and Rygate most recently indicated that they're not operating at extremely efficient levels. And so I'm just curious to know what is informing that part of his analysis.
I'm not sure if someone from BED wants to answer that, but go ahead, Richard.
I think it's a matter of compared to what. Is he comparing? I don't have the document in front of me, but is the comparison to other power plants, or is the comparison to other waste for burning wood? And those are very different comparisons. My impression was he was talking about power plants burning wood more efficiently than home heating systems do. But that was my impression, but I'd have to go back and look at it again.
I think my reading of that is just that it's combustion efficiency, which is quite high and efficient for Mcneil. But then there's, energy conversion efficiency, which is for power production using steam technology, which is quite low. So I think the distinction was the combustion efficiency being high, but the energy conversion being relatively low. I think it's an important distinction.
Judy, go ahead.
I was reading the chat and got sidetracked. My question is about the report that we received. When it says things are higher or not different or lower, what are they talking about? Higher to what, or lower to what, or lower than what, or higher than what?
Are we talking about the cancer and asthma? Because he was comparing it by sub-county level, I believe, if that's
So it means it's
relative to the state and national levels, I believe it was also.
no, I don't think it was national levels, because I looked.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to figure out what it was that was higher than or lower than when he used it on the charts.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, again, I don't have it in front of me, Judy, but my impression is that these were comparing small areas to the state as a whole.
So if it's already high and it's lower than other areas in the state, I guess I can't understand how to read the chart then, if it just says higher or lower.
That's 100% to you? Yeah. Yeah. Close enough. Green is HR for.
I'm happy to follow up and ask him to clarify that so it's clear for everyone. And I'm sure Jared would happily, if there's still lingering questions, join us again at a future meeting. But understanding that it likely is comparison across in the smaller county components of the state with the largest data for the state, we can ask Jared about that. But seeing that perhaps that the details of the data are the lingering questions, if there's no other comments or questions, I thought we might move on to the presentation so we could stay on point for today.
I also know,
okay?
Yeah, I also know that Annette is not going to be available at the end. So what is to answer her question that she has in the chat box, what is the answer to that? To the
compare why they do, if BD does analysis at the 2.5 level versus 10.
Yeah.
The gentleman, I'm sorry, Paul, was it that spoke up earlier on the data? Is that a comment that you're willing to, a question that you can answer easily for us?
I guess my comment is we follow our Title V permit explicitly. So we do biannual in situ stack testing to confirm our particulate matter and our Title V compliance. As an example, our last testing in 2021, our permit level is 0.007 pounds per million, ppm corrected at 12% CO2. Our testing average was 0.00119. So we are significantly below our permitted levels of particulate matter.
All right, I'm sorry for my internet connectivity, but finally I'm on. So And is that just a final question from Annette? Is the permitting is primarily PM10? Is there a permit requirement for 2.5? Paul, do you know that?
I mean,
Oh, Paul, you're on mute.
Yep, sorry, thank you. Yeah, I would have to confirm the testing methodology, but I do not believe so. Pending confirmation, I believe PM10 is the standard.
Okay, why don't we just note that as maybe an action item, Jane, and then we can come back in writing or otherwise try to clarify that. Okay.
So
Word on that.
isn't that problematic if if you have all these medical issues at 2.5?
Richard, do you want to? I mean, I think one is like sort of health effects vis-a-vis regulatory requirements. But Richard, I don't know if you want to speak to either Judy's question or the PM particle size, or Richard, you're on mute.
I just want to be sure that we don't confuse the measurements at the power plant with the ambient air measurements in the community. Those are two different parameters.
And Judy, to your point, I think that we need to kind of understand what the regulatory scheme is. That may or may not be satisfactory, but it's what it's what EPA or the state currently uses as requirements.
Right, but also we're only talking, Richard, hundreds of feet away, our houses.
And I guess a question, and I think maybe we put this on hold for now to continue the discussion, but in terms of air quality, the question is also where is the releases of the particulates and other either criteria pollutants or hazard or HAPs from the plant, and are they primarily through a smokestack? What's their kind of trajectory vis-a-vis the community or the broader region or area too? But those are questions maybe for another day. Okay, Richard, anything else before we? Okay. So I know a number of questions left, so we kind of note this. We'll try to figure out how to circle back on air quality. And Annette, thanks for raising the question.
I can just jump in real quick.
Yeah,
Jane
Charlie.
has circulated, this is Billy, Mcneil's air permit several meetings ago. I just did a quick scan and there's at least a chart in there that says unless otherwise specified, all PM is assumed to be PM 2.5. So
let's confirm that, but Billy, thanks for looking that up. Appreciate it. Okay, so as we start, I think our presentation, again, we're now kind of getting into one of the questions that the original Ag and Eco Group raised around, expansion of the expansion is a complicated word, but expansion of the plant for, essentially cogeneration or thermal as well as electricity. And people have had a lot of questions about that. So we've appreciated Burlington Electric being here, having a conversation about this. We know in our group, there's a range of views on the plants themselves. So we're not here today to debate with Burlington Electric whether or not the plant should be there. I think we're really here to try to understand proposals and the like and thoughts, and make sure all of us have an understanding as the group takes this as information for further deliberation, that we will discuss some of the issues that like. And Judy, to your point, I think we need to circle back on some of these air quality questions. So I think we'll need to figure out how in the next agenda to circle back on them, whether we need to bring someone back to answer some of them. So yeah, I think it's an action item at this point for sure. I think with that, Jane, I don't know if you want to introduce our speakers, and then we'll jump right in.
Sure. So I really appreciate Darren Springer, who's the general manager of Burlington Electric Department, joining us today and bringing with him his colleagues who are experts on this component of the district heat project, the history of it and where it's going, as well as consultants who have worked to study the applicability of this. So Darren, I know you have a number of colleagues with you, and I'd appreciate if you could take the time to introduce them. And Darren and folks have a presentation to give us on the project, and then are willing to stay and engage in a discussion with all of you around questions that you have. So thanks so much for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Jane. Great to be here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Darren Springer, General Manager with Burlington Electric. I'm joined by several colleagues at Burlington Electric, including James Gibbons, our Director of Policy and Planning, Paul Pickna, Senior Generation Engineer at Mcneil, who you've heard from already, Betsy Lesnikoski, our Chief Forester at the Mcneil Generating Station. I'm also joined by two colleagues from outside of BED who have been critical partners with us on the District Energy Initiative, and that is Tom Murray with Vermont Gas has joined us, as well as
Michael Ahern, Senior VP at Evergreen Energy from Minnesota. Evergreen is a company that operates district energy systems around the country, including a well-known biomass district energy system in Minnesota. So we're all happy to talk about district energy. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to share my screen and run through a few slides and then take some questions as well. Let me just get this.
Great. And just so we check, how long is your presentation?
I've got maybe 14 slides, should take hopefully no more than 15 minutes or so, if that's okay. All right, can folks see my screen? Excellent. Okay. So just a little about BED before we jump into district energy. For folks who may not be familiar, we're an over 100-year-old public power utility for the city of Burlington. We are the third largest electric utility in the state of Vermont and the largest municipal utility. About 75% of our customers are residential and 25% commercial. Although with our energy use, it's pretty much flipped. It's about 75% commercial and 25% residential. So commercial is a significant energy component for us. We do operate the Mcneil plant, which is now the largest energy producer in the state of Vermont after Vermont Yankee closed in 2013. Burlington has the distinction of being the first city in the nation to source 100% of our power from renewable generation as of 2014. I believe there have been perhaps 5 communities that have joined us since that time, and many others that are striving to get there. We had a pretty extraordinary period from 2009 to 2021 where we were able to hold rates steady. We have had rate change since the pandemic, and we have another one proposed, 3.95% proposed for FY23, responding to some of the economic conditions that I know every organization is seeing. And we are working to implement the Net Zero Energy 2030 roadmap, which is one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious, climate goals at a local level anywhere in the country. So we're excited to be here talking to the Climate Council, given our work on climate in Burlington. A little about the Mcneil Station as well. Mcneil is jointly owned by BED, which we have a 50% share, Green Mountain Power, 31%, and Vermont Public Power Supply Authority at 19%. It was built in the 1980s under then Mayor Bernie Sanders. We have really a significant number of significant benefits from having Mcneil, not only from the utility standpoint, but from the broader state and community standpoint. We did some analysis with a third party as part of our IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, in 2020 that looked at Mcneil's impact economically, found that the plant was supporting 80 jobs, both at the plant and in the wood supply chain, with $4.5 million in annual wages. And it showed approximately a $50 million economic impact for Vermont, and that Mcneil was purchasing wood from lands in 8 different Vermont counties as of 2019. Very much timely, unique for our renewable generator. A number of renewable generators, if we think about solar or wind or hydro, produce when available. Mcneil can store fuel on site and be dispatched based on the market needs. That's very, very unique for a renewable plant. As we saw last winter, I believe ISO New England had the most expensive January in its history. If you look at what's being run in the ISO grid during the wintertime, we are typically a heavily natural gas region. Gas is constrained in the winter due to heating needs, and you'll see coal and oil being used sometimes as the marginal fuel when gas is not available. Mcneil was able to run 24/7 during the last winter, helping to offset some of the region's reliance on fossil fuels during that time and supporting the ratepayers of the various utilities that own the plant by reducing their otherwise what would have been a very expensive cost for power. And I know there was some discussion about air emissions earlier. I wanted to note in 2008, Mcneil installed a regenerative selective catalytic reduction system that helped reduce air pollutants further. As Paul noted, we're well below our permitted levels. And just a little more about Mcneil. Here you can see a picture of our forestry team. We have 4 foresters, professional foresters at the plant. They monitor the wood supply and the harvest for us. And as indicated here, About 76% of our harvests were occurring on lands covered by the state approved use value management plans, 95% developed under U.S. Forest Service guidelines. And I think Mcneil is well known in Burlington for operating the waste wood yard, where residents can bring untreated wood to be used at the plant instead of having that wood go to a landfill, for example. We have our wood ash is used as both a soil conditioner and as ash for road projects. And I think it's important to note that Mcneil provides an economic value in the forestry supply chain such that it supports lands staying as working lands as opposed to facing development pressures in some cases. And that's important for carbon sequestration, of course. In terms of 2019 data, the annual growth of Vermont forests, if you look at how much was growing, about 50% of the growth was harvested, and the other 50% was able to add to the above ground stored biomass. And Mcneil wood residue usage accounted for 8% of Vermont harvests and 4% of the state's growth, just to give you a perspective on our usage of wood. We see Mcneil as an innovation site for the future. It will soon be home to a new solar research facility in partnership with UVM that was supported by Senator Sanders. And we're also looking at opportunities for battery storage at the plant as well. So moving to district energy, the main topic this morning. District energy is the long-held idea here in Burlington of capturing waste heat and additional steam from Mcneil and transporting it to large customers such as the medical center or UVM. I think if you look at Mcneil's original permit, this was cited as a potential use in that permit back in the 80s. Why is it important for us at this moment in time is that in addition to all the benefits of turning Mcneil into a combined heat and power facility, providing some modest improvements in efficiency for the plant, district energy was identified as one of the 4 key pathways in our 2019 net zero energy roadmap for the city, and will help reduce commercial sector natural gas emissions by 11.5% or more, and represents the single biggest step we can take in Burlington to reduce emissions in that sector. And so this is part of the city's strategy to meet our climate goal. A little bit of history on district energy. This has been an issue that has been studied many, many times in the past. As mentioned, it was in the original permit for the plant. There were feasibility studies that predate my time at BED back in 1994, 96, 98, 2002, and 2014. None of those led to kind of an additional step beyond the feasibility work. In 2014, Mayor Weinberger had asked BED to look at this and determine once and for all whether we can move it forward. In 2016, there was a partnership to look at this with Corix Utilities and included a variety of partners outlined here, including UVM Medical Center and City Place, BED and VGS. Corix had a feasibility study at a high level on a life cycle basis in 2017 that found district energy could be competitive with conventional systems. We had conversations with potential customers, 2017, 2018. The City Council approved filing with the PUC for a ruling on rate regulation of the district energy system locally, and the PUC approved that filing. During the legislative sessions, 2018 and 2019, we worked with the legislature to achieve the ability to use some of our thermal energy and process fuel funds to support the district energy feasibility work. Act 102 of 2018 and Act 31 of 2019, which were both passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, approved our doing that. And unfortunately, with the Corix effort, we were not able to get where we needed to be in terms of the economics of the plant with the customers. We did not have customers interested in moving forward. And the MOU with Corix expired. And at that time, I became general manager of Burlington Electric in October of 2018. I started at BED in January of 2017. So I was part of some of this work, as were my colleagues. When the Corix MOU expired, we worked with VGS and began looking at this anew with Evergreen Energy, a different organization. And we did phase 1 feasibility work with Evergreen and focused on the idea of using steam instead of hot water. The Corix system was a hot water system that would have gone downtown and to UVM and the medical center. It was a larger system. We wanted to look at whether there would be a better economic route for a steam system that would be more compatible with some of the customer and use systems, and do a smaller loop, because at that time we were aware that the downtown project wasn't going to be completed in the time frame we were looking at. And what Evergreen found was that there was an economic route to doing that at a lower cost and still getting the majority of the emissions reduction benefits. So we completed a phase 1 feasibility study with Evergreen. What happened next is really historic for district energy. It never happened before. In phase 2, we reached agreement to move to phase 2 beyond the initial feasibility in February of 2020, including additional engineering work, economic analysis and modeling, regulatory and financing and structures for operating the potential system, establishing protocols for operations. I've included a link here to the press release for that, and I will share these slides, Jane, with you as soon as we're finished here, so you can distribute them to the group and for the public. What happened then is we continued our work, and in February of 2021, amidst the pandemic, which did slow us down a little bit, as it did a number of key projects, we did reach agreement to move to a phase 3 of our work with Evergreen, UVM Medical Center, the City of Burlington, BED, VGS. What happened in phase 2, what we reported out to the City Council, is an idea that really draws on community solar, for example, and the Cow Power program here in Vermont and others, where we could have the physical steam delivery of the district energy system occurring at UVM Medical Center and/or UVM and possibly some Intervale Center buildings. But we could also create renewable thermal credits that represent the environmental attributes of the system and allow any customer in Burlington who's connected to VGS's system, which is roughly 95% of Burlingtonians, to be able to buy into the district energy system through a voluntary tariff, very similar to what VGS does currently with their renewable gas program. We did find in phase 2 that costs for the project were increasing, although we were able to add some additional carbon reduction to the model that included adding the idea of an electric boiler that would run on our 100% renewable power and act as a supplementary steam source, which could run if Mcneil was offline, could run during times where we had excess renewables on the grid and we needed an opportunity to utilize them. And the phase 3 work was going to include identifying grant funding for the project, completing a test run at Mcneil, additional work on thermal energy agreements, and additional engineering work. And again, I have a link to that at the bottom of the page. This schematic here is just a representation of what I had just described as kind of the more innovative model for district energy, where we would have Mcneil generating the steam along with the electric boiler, waste heat and steam. That would be provided to a nonprofit called Burlington District Energy that would be operated by Evergreen. They would then sell the steam to VGS and the attributes to VGS, even if the steam delivery was happening at several customer sites like the medical center, for example. And then, as you can see at the bottom here, residences, businesses, the city of Burlington could buy renewable district energy credits that would be similar treatment as renewable gas. And it really creates the opportunity to make this more of a community project than simply a project for the largest commercial customers that would accept the steam. VGS could potentially utilize some of these credits for its own portfolio as well. And this model had never been thought of or created before for district energy. If you're thinking about the route here, this is from the 2021 memo to City Council. You can see at the top of the screen the Mcneil plant and the route that would run up Intervale Road and then up towards the hospital, and with the potential to have a lateral that would connect several UVM buildings. And the idea is that on the way back, we would also pick up a few Intervale Center buildings if possible. So the district system, so to speak, would be, as proposed, UVM Medical Center's main campus, several UVM buildings in the vicinity, and then back towards the Intervale Center. So where are we today, 2022? We've completed the phase 3 work, including a successful Mcneil operational test last summer, developing the third-party engineering review, updating economics, developing thermal energy agreements. We were very pleased that Senator Leahy was able to, in the last appropriations bill, secure over $5 million in federal grant funding for the project, which we are now in the process of working on the paperwork with the Department of Energy to access those funds. The Burlington City Council has unanimously approved our accepting that grant. The council also approved a resolution to create a 501c3 entity to run that nonprofit district energy system with Evergreen. And BED and Evergreen are applying for additional federal funds, competitive funds. We have an application pending. In June, so this has just happened, we have a letter agreement between BED, VGS, Evergreen, the City of Burlington, UVM Medical Center, and the Intervale Center that is going to guide our work on district energy for the remaining part of 2022 and early 2023. There are some challenges. We've made it further, obviously, than this project's ever gone in the past. There are some challenges. Construction costs, for example, with inflation are moving in the wrong direction, and we're looking at opportunities to get updated construction pricing later in the year that will hopefully show some downward trend. Interest rates for financing are a challenge at the moment, and this as a nonprofit debt financed project, this would be a challenge. We would benefit from lower rates, and energy markets are incredibly volatile right now. The forward pricing, for example, on the New England grid is at historic levels. We're facing the challenge of not having enough natural gas already in the New England grid to operate the grid, not having enough renewables, in my view, to offset the gas, and having that gas now be potentially shipped elsewhere due to global crises is going to drive prices up, all things considered. And obviously, other fuel prices are also volatile at the moment. Our work now is to look at trying to update all of the economic costs and inputs, secure purchasers for the renewable thermal credits, and attempt to make a final go, no-go decision in late 2022 or early 2023. And I think I kept about to 15 minutes there. I note that originally Neil Lunderville was going to join us. That's why he's on this slide, but he wasn't able to this morning. So Tom Murray's here from BGS. And I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, come back to the group here, and we are glad to provide more information or answer any questions.
Great, Darren, thank you, and you're right on time, so appreciate that. So I think questions from the working group, and just raise your hand. And there's opening slides that covered a lot of other issues, but let's focus on kind of district heating for now and questions about that. So raise your hand, jump in for questions about the proposed project. Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Darren. That was a lot of information. So, a lot to digest for the group. I think if at a very kind of high level, you could just respond to the main reasons for the delays in this development of the district heating. From the presentation, it sounds like the main drivers of delay had to do with just the economic viability of it and some considerations around steam versus hot water. So if you were to sum it up just in one sentence, why hasn't this moved forward since the idea to now? Is that an accurate kind of reflection back to you, or am I missing something there?
I would say, without having personally been involved, that the earlier feasibility studies had never resulted in an economically attractive project that drew in all the necessary partners to move it forward. I would say that at least since I've been at BED in January of 2017, and I know the kind of immediate work predates my arrival, and a number of my colleagues and Neil Lunderville, when he was general manager prior to me, we're all working on this. I think what we've demonstrated is a significant amount of forward progress over the last 5 years. I've personally invested countless hours, as have my colleagues, in moving this project to a point where it is way further down the path towards viability than it ever has been. So I think we've demonstrated a lot of progress in the last 5 years in overcoming systemically the obstacles that have been there in the past. And we're fortunate to really good partner with Evergreen as well, and to have developed kind of a nonprofit model that involves a number of important community partners and have the support from the city and the mayor and the city council.
Trudy, over to you next.
I didn't see in any of your slides archaeological studies. When Mayor Kiss was in office, both he and I went up to the environmental board, and we had all of that land placed on the state historical register for the most highly sensitive archaeological sites in the state. And as you go up the hill, it gets more sensitive.
And so, and other colleagues may want to speak to this. I know for the solar project, for example, that's being permitted, we had extensive review with the state archaeologist and my colleagues to make sure that we were not doing anything that would be not permitted under the current regulations and respecting the archaeological value at the site. District Energy, likewise, if it was to move forward, would go through various permits and processes, and the infrastructure would be designed in a way to be fully accommodating the fact that it is an archaeologically historic and significant site.
Is that site north, south, east, or west of your plant?
Betsy or James may want to speak more specifically to the site.
That's not a single answer, Judy. I'm afraid it's, there's a part of it, would be in one location. There would be a piping route.
North, south, east, or west of your plant?
Judy, I can't answer that exactly because there's going to be components north and south rather and east more than west or north, I believe is a general statement for that.
And you've done archaeological
Not pending.
Phase 1.
Archaeology for both projects is required and is pending.
Okay.
Meaning, we have not actually started that work, but it is required, clearly.
Right. So that is clearly going to put a halt to your timeline.
No, we built that into our timeline.
James, I have a question for you. When you do the cultural resource and connect with the state SHPO, is there any, during that cultural resource kind of work, is there any public comment or public hearings or meetings that are required?
So I was in the Vermont Archaeological Study many years ago, but I am not an expert anymore. I wasn't then, frankly. The first contact was between myself and the Department of State Historical Preservation to just sort of get some guidance on were there areas, to go to Judy's point, are there areas that are more sensitive to be avoided at all costs, that kind of context. It was not the Department of Historic Preservation signing off on anything.
Was that Scott Dillon?
Yes.
Yeah, so Scott is fully aware of where burial sites are and all kinds of things in your proposed route.
Yeah, that was a pre-screen. And then we actually have to do proper archaeological work under both the Solar Test Center 248 permit, and if we decided to actually put in any infrastructure for the district energy that was below grade.
So that
has not been done yet.
That's not been done yet. Okay. And Darren and James and Judy, maybe to follow up, I know one of the questions that arose out of the previous Ag and Eco Committee, of which the Biomass and this group was created, was just questions about what district energy or would do to the footprint of the plant in terms of like physically what it would expand the plant. Obviously, there's construction for the piping or whatever it's called. Would there be increases in emissions? Would there be increases in fuel use? So I think people were just trying to understand what would be when you would do this, what would expansion mean on various variables?
Right, because on the picture in the Intervale Center, it shows a huge increase for holding the steam itself to the north of your plant.
I think, and Michael Ahern may want to speak to this, or Paul Pickna as well. I think in terms of the district project, if you think about the infrastructure, other than locating an electric boiler, which is not necessarily, that could be within the footprint of the plant. The other major infrastructure is the steam piping that would go from Mcneil into the street right of way and then up towards the various campuses that I mentioned. We'll look at a variety of designs for how to make that infrastructure as sensitive as we can make it to the various components of the site, as we were talking about. But if you're thinking about infrastructure at the plant, it's a steam pipe. And maybe Michael, if you want to describe that in a little more detail, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, the steam, there'd be two pipes, a steam supply and a condensate return. The steam supply is a 10-inch pipe, 10-inch diameter pipe, and the condensate return will be a 3-inch diameter pipe. And they will, for the bulk of that running up to UVMC and UVM will be buried underground in the public right of way. There may be at the plant itself a little bit of above ground pipe on a pipe bridge that would look very similar to what you see down at the plant today with some of the other above ground pipe and ducting and so forth. And from a architectural perspective, it would look very similar to what you see today.
And Patrick, I saw your note in the chat. In terms of kind of additional wood fuel use, there would be a moderate amount of additional wood fuel use as part of district energy. I don't know if Betsy or Paul or Michael would want to maybe comment on that further.
As far as I'm concerned, wood fuel use would be up about 4 to 5%. Looking at our FY23 budget figures, it's basically an increase about 1.5 weeks of full load usage over time. So it's fairly insignificant as far as extra wood is involved.
And the primary reason for the extra wood is we don't actually want to reduce the net electrical output of the plant because of reliability and economic reasons. The plant itself is fairly important to operate. So we plan to operate the plant at a net electrical output of 50 megawatts still with district energy in place.
And then Darren, to emissions, do you know about emissions effects at all? And I'll go to Richard after that.
When you're speaking about emissions, what specifically were you referencing?
Whether it's just your criteria pollutants or things that you're already regulated for, will you have actually an increase in those because of the change?
I don't know if Michael or Paul want to speak to that. Obviously, that would be a part of any permit update we would submit, but I don't know if we have anything to reflect on at this point.
Yeah, I think at a high level, there would be no intent of seeking higher emissions limits. Of course, if capacity factors are affected by the installation, emissions would inherently go up, but nothing would be, there's no expectation to increase permit thresholds.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Richard, thanks for waiting. Over to Richard, then back to Judy.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one is, I think, really quick. The system would not operate except in winter, is that correct?
Not necessarily. The system would operate potentially more in the wintertime because Mcneil also operates more in the wintertime and the need would be more in the wintertime, but it could have other seasonal operation as well.
What would the steam be used for when it's not being used for building heat?
The medical center, for example, uses a significant amount of processed steam.
Sterilization, domestic hot water, things such as that.
Chillers.
Okay, all right. So, and does it operate equally efficiently, do you think, at low volumes as at high volumes?
Michael, you go ahead on that one.
Yeah, it doesn't change the seasonality doesn't change the efficiency of the district energy system.
Okay, thanks. The other question I have, I'm a greenhouse gas absolutist. My interest is in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So just as a factual question, does the projected operation of the steam system require use of fossil fuels at various parts of the process?
So I think I understand your question, but let me try to answer it. The steam system would not be fossil fuel based.
No, I got that. It wouldn't be fossil fuel based, but are there parts of the process, for example, you mentioned that you would have a backup boiler to use when Mcneil is out of service. So presumably that's going to burn some kind of fossil fuel. No?
Absolutely not. No, that is an electric boiler that would be 100% renewable, connected to our Burlington electric system. So there is no new fossil fuel infrastructure as part of this project. It's 100% renewable.
Okay, so some fossil fuel will be used in the construction of the project, but which you can amortize over time.
Of course.
I'm just going to go on record as saying that although this whole project is predicated on the idea that burning wood is 100% renewable, and I think that is open to at least some conversation as to whether that's 100% true. I don't want to get in this. This is not the right place for that argument. I'm just skeptical about assertions that burning wood is 100% renewable.
I would only offer, without getting into the details, because I'm sure we could talk about it for a while. We certainly believe it is renewable. I think we've demonstrated that over a nearly 40-year run at Mcneil, being able to supply the plant while maintaining forest cover in Vermont. People have very good and hearty debates around the carbon accounting of wood. I appreciate the nuance to those debates. I think personally, from the literature I've reviewed, that wood in a sustainably harvested plant like Mcneil that's operated for a number of years and paid off whatever carbon debt you might assume can have a beneficial climate impact. I understand as well that there are uses of wood in the biomass industry that would not have a beneficial impact. So I think there's a lot of nuance to that discussion, and I'm proud of the work we do at Burlington Electric in that regard.
I'm sure you are, and I should preface this by saying that I understand that moving from coal to wood was an improvement.
Appreciate that.
Judy, over to you. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Are you telling us that there is no fossil fuels used at the plant now?
No, that's not what I'm saying. The plant does not use fossil fuel as its primary combustion. We're a wood chip plant, but there are associated uses of fossil fuels, just like there are for any plant practically. Every plant has some sort of life cycle, as Richard mentioned, either in the construction or in some cases the operation.
Well, in this case, the operation, right? So we have the fossil fuel for people cutting the trees. We have the fossil fuel being used for it to be chipped and delivered to the trains, the diesel fuel being used to bring the chips to your facility, the fossil fuels for the loaders to unload it and move it around. And there's some fossil fuels used in the facility as well, correct?
Paul, do you want to? Well, actually, I want to speak to. I'll have Paul Picknett just speak to the operational piece in a minute. But you're correct, Judy, that there are those types of associated uses. We actually did some analysis, a third-party analysis with VEIC, looking at this exact question. Kind of quantifying all of the various fossil fuel inputs that would go into the wood supply chain, the operations at the facility. We accounted for all of those, and then we compared the plant to a natural gas combustion plant that would be the marginal plant on the ISO grid. And we didn't even assume anything upstream regarding methane leakage or fossil fuel inputs. We just looked at the combustion on natural gas. And even with all of the inputs you just mentioned, Mcneil still had about an 84 to 85% better carbon footprint than the natural gas plant. So it's an important component of greenhouse gas accounting, and we've looked at that.
Thank you. Could we have a copy of that report?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Be glad to.
I have a couple more questions. The storage tanks that were proposed to be north of the plant to hold the steam, is that currently part of your proposal?
Michael, could you speak to that? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what tanks you're speaking of, Judy. I'm sorry.
Well, you did an archaeological report just north of your facility. And in that report, it was stated that the proposal was to put big tanks there to store the steam and use the steam for other things other than heat.
Judy, is that in the original proposal from 40 years ago that you're referring to?
No.
Okay.
Our current plan does not contemplate any storage tanks, so I'm not sure what you're speaking of. I'm sorry, Judy.
It was like greenhouses for the Intervale and places like that.
Oh, that's not part of the current project.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Also, somebody just mentioned a 4% increase in wood fuel. What will be the increase in particle matter?
I think Paul just spoke to that a moment ago. I don't know if we have specific projected numbers yet. I don't know, Paul or Michael, if we do. I think Paul indicated we'd still be below our permitted threshold, but I don't know if Michael or Paul want to speak further to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just all I can say is particulate matter capture is unchanged, and we would still operate within permitted limits. Excuse me. You know, as far as net pounds emitted, that's based on capacity factor. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's kind of the operational practice at this time.
So Paul, just to clarify, Paul, so if this project were to move forward, your permit levels you're set, you wouldn't seek to have them be raised higher. You would still meet them as they currently are. And if you are increasing fuel and therefore I assume combustion, you are going to increase particulates some small probably percentage amount against the total. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think there was a close to, if not linear, relationship as far as emissions versus combustion, which is related to capacity factor. Permit limits should not be affected to our knowledge.
And I just want to add, obviously, we're only looking at one side of the equation here in that conversation, because district energy means a heck of a lot less fossil fuel combustion in the city of Burlington. And I think as this is the Climate Council group, I want to make sure we're looking at it from a holistic standpoint, because our goal here is to reduce fossil fuel use in Burlington.
But is it at the expense of the health of people?
I'm not aware of data that indicates that, Judy.
I just spoke about that earlier and presented the link.
Yeah, and let's just recognize that's clearly one of the factors people have been talking about. Judy, any other questions? If I go to Charlie, then Chase. Okay, Charlie, you're up next.
No, my comment had to go back to the just the increase in fuel consumption at the plant, and this idea of how many more trees does that mean? And I just think it's important to point out that an increase in fuel consumption at Mcneil does not necessarily mean there's going to be an increase in harvesting on Vermont's forests at that matter. I mean, the market complexity here about where wood goes needs to be considered there. So I just want to make a very broad statement that an increase in fuel use at Mcneil does not necessarily mean an increase in harvesting levels in the state. It's a consideration we have to think about harvesting levels, but that's not a direct correlation here. I think Judy's got great questions about kind of what that means from an emission standpoint, but as far as the forests go, I think it's a separate consideration.
And one thing, as Jane will note towards the end of today, we're going to expand out beyond this in terms of kind of wood flows and fuel sources and this complex story Charlie just said. Not today, but it is on the agenda to try to cover. Just to note that. Chase. There's Chase. Chase, you're on mute.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm just curious to know if at Mcneil you all track the percentage of wood residue that makes up the total wood that you combust, and if so, what that percentage is, and whether or not you have set limits that require that a certain amount of the wood be residue, or whether that number fluctuates year to year. And by residue, just sort of a rough definition, treetops and limbs.
Yeah, thanks, Chase. I'm going to turn to Betsy to respond.
Okay, so I guess as residue, you mean tops and limbs. I would say that about 90% of what we get is forest residues from logging jobs, which is what's left after the higher value products have been separated out and sold. Very few jobs are just to produce wood chips for biomass. In fact, that just doesn't happen. We get about 5% from sawmills, which is the bark or chips left over sawdust after the lumber manufacturing process. And then about another 5% is from our waste wood yard, where we bring in the pallets and brush that would normally go into landfills and rot there. Does that answer your question?
That's really helpful. So it sounds like those numbers 90 plus 5 plus 5 is about 100%. Okay. And so is there a policy that you all have in place that requires wood residue to be 100% of the combustion, or is that something that just has occurred naturally?
Our permit requires us, we're only allowed to burn clean untreated wood. So we have no other choice. I mean, we have to burn 100% clean wood. Again, the majority of it comes from the forest after logging jobs are done. And then we do get a little bit of sawmill and waste wood residue.
So just to sort of close the loop, it sounds then like there's no internal obligation, no internal policy or anything that requires wood residue to be purchased and combusted, but that's something that because of sort of the market that you all are engaging in at this point in time.
Well, I'm a little confused because we can't burn anything but wood.
Right. I'm talking about wood residue. So specifically, like for example, you could potentially burn whole trees, which would not be wood residue.
Oh, yeah, well, very few because of the pricing structure. Loggers will separate out the higher value products, including the logs, the pulpwood, the firewood, anything else that they can get more money for. And it doesn't make sense economically to burn anything but the residues that are left over.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand. So there's no requirement. It's just something that you all do, that you do acquire just wood residues.
Yeah, it's an economic choice on everybody's part.
Okay, thank you.
So Betsy, I think what you just said, but it's the market really drives the kind of wood that you use is really driven by the market, which is then this kind of this residue surplus, whatever it's called, and that's really a market driver. Your requirement is that it's clean wood. It can't be,
Exactly. We can't burn anything that's been treated or painted or demolition type wood. We can't do that. It has to be all clean, untreated wood.
We have about a few minutes left before, and we want to make sure there is time for public comment. So for our working group members, any other questions on the district heating for Darren or others with the team? We have a few follow-ups, and Darren, well, Jane will always, as always, will follow up with email, but final questions or comments. Judy.
Of course, I got to have another comment, right? So I have a question. I see Tom Murray from Vermont Gas on here. And I am aware of your gas pipes and all of that running crisscross through the Intervale. Is there expected expansion on the gas pipes?
Nope, not. I know we serve, as Darren mentioned, we serve most of Burlington today, and so no, we actually don't have too many pipes in the Intervale proper, obviously, because it's mostly wetland and wetland areas. So no, we're not expanding pipe in any significant way in Vermont. We're trying to adapt to address climate change, and that's why we partnered on this innovative initiative with BED and the city and the various partners we're working with. So we hope to see this project move forward. It's an exciting project for us. It's it's kind of in this constellation of decarbonization things that I work on every day. And we hope to move the project forward, but it's complicated. There's a lot of different variables. So we got to work through those things and hope that we can make it all come together.
Thank you. And Darren, I was wondering why you chose an out-of-state middleman and why not an in-state? Why did you choose Evergreen?
So Evergreen actually has a history with this project, had been involved in some earlier feasibility work and was familiar with it. And in fact, one of our city councilors, former city councilor, Max Tracy, who was our city council president until just recently, had visited the Evergreen project in St. Paul, which is a wood chip district energy project, as I mentioned earlier, one of the longest running successful projects that Evergreen manages. And there's quite a bit of enthusiasm from Max and from folks as part of the Birdies group, which was the citizen-led group that supported district energy for partnering with Evergreen. They were supportive of the nonprofit model that we wanted to create here. And I think that they have expertise that is relatively unique. So, we're all about in-state. We love, most of our generation resources are here in Vermont, as Mcneil is. We really focus a lot when we talk about, charging an electric vehicle. We're keeping more dollars in state than when we send dollars out of state for fossil fuels. So all things equal, we always like to go in state and in Vermont. In this case, I think we had the right partner with Evergreen, given their operational expertise for district energy.
Thank you.
Great. All right, Jane, I'm going to turn over public comment to you. and we'll cover that. And then as Jane closes for us, she will also talk a little bit about kind of a preview of our next few meetings and what we're trying to cover as we start expanding out kind of fuel source flows to these plants, and then even get broader questions around kind of forest management and biomass more broadly. But Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks everyone for the conversation. Everybody's welcome to stay for public comment, obviously. But before we go to planning for the next few meetings, I did just want to offer a chance for members of the public to raise their hands and ask any questions they'd like. Cheryl, please, go ahead. Cheryl, are you able to come off mute and speak? I think it looks like you're on your phone, which is a star. I think it's star 6 or 0. I should know this by now, but if anybody has a tip for mobile. Okay. Cheryl, we can come back to you. Anyone else from the public have any comments or questions? Nope, there's perfect timing.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. So my power went out, obviously.
Yeah.
Can I ask a favor, please? I wonder if somebody might save the chat and send it to me. I would appreciate that.
I'm happy to do that. I always
because I can't do it.
Yep, I have it always.
Thanks so much, Jane. Thank you. Okay, so what I wanted to say is a couple different things. One is don't forget that in August,
looks like she dropped. We'll let Cheryl speak again if she's able to rejoin.
It sounds like she's losing her power.
Yeah, the phone doesn't sound like a great connection either. Cheryl, sorry, it looks like you're back.
Can you hear me still?
I can. You're kind of choppy though. It's not the best connection.
So let me just step outside and see if it's better there, because I think it's important what I want to say. Hold on, watch out,
Please.
Shadow.
You sound better, Rachel.
All right,
So go ahead.
can you hear me better now? Okay, so one thing is that I'm sure you're going to say this, Jane, but the biomass recommendations are expected in August. So I think there's a lot of work to do by then. Another thing is that I wrote this in the chat, and if somebody wants to read it out, that would be great, but I want to say it out loud. Reduce fuel to reduce greenhouse gas. So feel free to please read that chat right out loud. If I missed something from what I put in there, which was, we want to do that without exacerbating the biodiversity crisis, because it's not just to reduce greenhouse gases, it's to also not cause other problems, right? And it's definitely not only to reduce fossil fuels, it's to reduce, that's not the goal, it's to mitigate climate change. And decarbonization, well, that's a kind of an interesting phrase, but I get it if people want to use that phrase. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say is that when you have people that are really experienced and educated on a topic that you're discussing, even when they are just only a visiting member of the public, like, as you have a few people that continuously come to these meetings, you ought to allow them to be part of the conversation rather than only making a comment at the end, because, well, obviously that's proven to be ineffective to date. The knowledge that some other people are bringing that are not in the task group and that are not invited like presenters really should be available used. A lot of really good information and good experience and education, you know, that you guys have. That's not only the ones that you're inviting. So, but to be part of the conversation is much more effective than to just make a singular comment at the end. So those were the three things I wanted to say. So, yep. We still don't have power. I don't know what's going on. Well, I sort of do know, actually. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks for persevering to make your comment. And two responses.
Now I have
One,
to figure out how to like.
I can do that for you, actually. So there you go. I will say that I appreciate that there is a lot of comments in the chat, and know that while we've encouraged folks to not use the chat till the end so we can focus in on the conversation, that it is a way for the public to engage in the conversation, and have noted that Judy, Pat, others have tried to lift up questions where they make sense to the relative presentations from the public, and appreciate that it's a different perspective that you all bring. And so my apologies that not everybody is around the table all the time, but I think folks try to do a good job of interjecting relative questions and comments where they're applicable. I will say that the comment you made about the timeline for recommendations is a good transition for us to talk about for a few minutes the next steps with this task group. It's not necessarily a timeline of August for draft recommendations. The timeline has been that when the Climate Council itself chose to table the actions from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee that were brought up by a subset of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee to the Council. Originally, it was projected that those actions would be reconsidered in the spring. You'll all recall that we were working on a fall timeline. The Climate Council has not been meeting this summer. The steering committee of the Climate Council has been in preparation for fall council meetings. The council meetings have been set now for September, October, November, and December. I think the intent is really that the council will have sort of these robust fall sessions in order to prepare for the legislative session. And the council's agenda for this fall is to take up any recommendations that are put forward by this task group and the transportation task group as potential addendums to the climate action plan. Additional priorities for the Climate Council also include a budget process to consider any budgetary recommendations in line with the timing of the governor's budget, as well as any additional prioritization the council may choose to do in order to be prepared with legislative priorities in this new biennium. So the timeline I know for the transportation task group, I will say, is to put forward potential recommendations for the cross-sector subcommittee to consider in August, and for them to be working on a timeline that looks to have those draft recommendations go to the council in October for consideration. So that's the timeline for that task group. This group, we're sort of picking away at the final presentations and dialogue around that first component of the scope, looking at electricity, biomass for electricity-led plants, and what to do with the recommendations around Mcneil, Rygate, and then expansion of those. And after next week's, I shouldn't say next week, after the meeting in 2 weeks from now, where our intent is to sort of revisit any lingering questions that have been left unanswered from conversations. So it feels like there are a number of questions around the health impact still that we can revisit, but also to have a larger conversation around the larger benefits of these plants around keeping forest, and which we haven't sort of hit head on to have questions and discourse around. We'll have a presentation with that that will be focused on some staff from Forest Parks and Recreation, but also hopefully perspective of local landowners who see this as a viable way to help them keep their woods as a woodlot and not converting, as well as some other voices in the conversation. From there, we can start to sort of close the door on how we want to draft recommendations around the electricity-led plants, and then shift more into what we want to do with biomass procurement. I will say that 2 meetings from now, so a month from now, I was able to line up. And so it sort of still looks at the electricity-led plants, a conversation with fish and wildlife staff who review harvests for Rygate and BD with specific criteria in mind, so folks can understand what the regulatory tools are now to influence biomass procurement. And I believe they've invited the Rygate forester to join so that they can speak to management themselves. And then from there, my hope was to sort of put forward a framework for how we're thinking about biomass procurement, and perhaps try a statement around policy, because I will say that I worry that this conversation could go on for much beyond the fall. So want to test with you all a statement that we could all work on together around biomass procurement that included tangible next steps to how we would further investigate that and recommendations in that space. So that is what we're thinking about for the next 2 meetings. And based on any of those sort of the alignment for that, I encourage task group members to continue to reach out to me with ideas of speakers or any sort of change in course that you'd like to see. And a final note, I'll just say more broadly about the question of greenhouse gas emissions and biomass. I did put this in the chat, but I know Judy is part of this. Richard is also part of this, Colin. We have a separate task group for the life cycle analysis. That RFP closed last Friday, and we have 3 excellent proposals that I just haven't had a chance to assimilate with a ranking sheet. But my intent is this morning is to share with the life cycle analysis task group the proposals we received and a schedule for reviewing and ranking those. So many of those questions around the greenhouse gas benefits of burning wood will be further considered as we move forward with that analysis. So Cheryl, I just want to focus this conversation with the task group right now. And then if we have time at the end, happy to take further comment from you. Judy, please go ahead.
You keep referring to writing something to move forward with biomass, or something to write a positive. I don't feel like I have enough answers to make a decision to move forward. I feel like I have more questions now after hearing the people speak about the damage the wood does, and then not getting an adequate report about the health issues. So I have more questions than I have feelings like we can move forward. So I mean, I realize it's your job to do that and move us forward, but I wouldn't be so confident in saying that all our questions are answered.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I'll just say that when I allude to sort of trying to think about how we would frame recommendations, the world of biomass procurement, as we start to dive into what that could look like, feels potentially very big and endless, and perhaps not a place that we can reasonably expect to have all of our questions answered by this fall. And so one of the ideas I'd like to propose to all of you is having some concrete recommendations around the electricity plants, because I do feel like we've spent some significant time thinking about those. And as I've started to prepare and think about how we could look at the biomass procurement questions, I'm wondering if we could take a look at a statement around that and perhaps not agree to what the recommendations are, but agree to what some reasonable next steps would be outside, perhaps in this task group, perhaps outside of this task group, that would further advance the conversation in that space. Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, you just covered what I was going to say, Jane, pretty well. But I mean, I agree with you, Judy, that there's so many things that have come up through this that kind of open new avenues of questions and new avenues of discussion and investigation. And so I think, like Jane said, the hope would be that we'd be able to come to a place where the recommendation isn't like a be all end all, yes, no, up, down kind of thing, but more, okay, here are the areas that need more investigation. And then there's kind of, I think Cheryl has pointed out, there's areas where I don't think we have the expertise here to really kind of find that answer. And so I think part of the statement Jane's talking about would be saying, get these players in the room to discuss this, or get this group together to discuss that. So it's not kind of like a final thing, but more of a intermediary. We've worked for 6 months, 7 months on this. We've come to this kind of conclusion around maybe this thing, but we realize that all of this work needs to advance. And here's kind of the framework we're suggesting for that. So I think that would be something we could shoot for, Jane. I agree that maybe trying to look for something like that in the next month or two would be good.
Thanks, Charlie, for further clarifying. Chase.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to sort of build, I think, on what Judy said, but a little bit differently, that I too feel as if there hasn't been enough investigation yet. In large part because, as I understand it, the charge of this group right now is to look at wood biomass for electricity generation. But we have actually not really investigated very much research or data about electricity generation. Most of the research we've been looking at so far has been informed by studies about wood combustion for thermal applications, which is not what we're investigating right now and is different. And so I think that there's a lot more research that's already out there that's been done that we could discuss. There certainly are more authors, peer-reviewed papers whom we could invite, and additional studies that we could discuss. And specifically and relevant to the actual question before us, wood combustion for electricity generation, which is different from what we've already discussed. And I think sort of the sub part to that, or relatedly, is that when we did look at some research pertaining to wood combustion for electricity, the comparison by which we were assessing greenhouse gas emissions benefits was comparing wood combustion to fossil fuels, coal primarily. But that's not really relevant to the Vermont context, because we don't source our electricity from coal in Vermont. We primarily get it from hydro dams and from other sources. We get some from the residual mix in ISO New England, but that's primarily natural gas, not coal. And so I think even the assumptions that we've been discussing about wood for electricity generation are sort of compared against an inaccurate representation of the alternative that we would have in Vermont, which would probably be something like more hydropower and not more coal. So all of that is to say, I think that we certainly could do more research, take a deeper dive into the true implications of wood combustion for electricity generation here in Vermont that we haven't yet done.
So I guess let's parse this out and really quickly. One of the components that I was trying to sort of start to wind down on presentations is around the electricity plants, because I was starting to feel like there could be consensus on what to do with McNeil and Reigate specifically, where I was perhaps shifting to think about a statement was not on the electricity-led plants, but on biomass procurement, which is a much bigger conversation. So if we took that apart, maybe what I'm hearing from you, Chase, is that it's premature, and I want to test this with the group, to try to shift to biomass procurement when there's still more information you need to understand how to develop and craft recommendations around biomass for electricity generation. Because we started with the premise that the recommendation that was tabled was the recommendation would be, from a climate perspective, there would be no new biomass electricity-led plants in Vermont. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I suspect that we could probably still make that statement as like that now, and therefore it's more. And why we looked at the thermal district heat was we were only considering expansion of the current plants around the potential for district heat. And so I guess I ask you all if anybody is feeling like biomass for electricity plants is something that we still want to recommend as a component of as a climate solution. And because I thought that conversation was winding down, I thought we could start to shift to biomass procurement. And I will say we're over time, and so I'll happy to hear more comments if folks can stay. If folks need to go, please do, and you're welcome to sort of send me your comments around these issues and the scope in particular via email, and I can take them into consideration as we craft agendas for future meetings. Richard.
Yeah, I just want to say that in Chase's comments, I particularly like the compared to what question. It's hard to look at one mode of electricity generation without considering the alternatives. Good or bad is not an absolute thing, it's a relative thing. Given that we need a certain amount of electricity generation, is adding biomass burning capacity a sensible way to do it from a greenhouse gas point of view compared to the alternatives?
And I will say that that was part of the original scope, but is sort of been parked because of the life cycle analysis. And I do think that without the life cycle analysis, I'm not sure how we do that.
Well, maybe we wait for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna just tag on to what Richard said. With the information I have now, I would still be saying what Ag and Eco committee said when they put their proposal forward, was no expansion of these two plants.
I'm sorry, I have to go. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Billy. If folks have other papers or other interest of speakers, please do send them to me, but maybe the intent will be to try to sort of leave more time teed up at the next meeting with Pat's support to actually think about a schedule for work planning and what we can and can't do for this fall with respect to recommendations. And maybe it is compartmentalizing different components of the work that we feel like we can answer now versus what we feel like we need the life cycle analysis for, and or additional expertise in other groups to consider. Seeing no other hands, we'll try to do that. And yeah, thank you. Bye, you guys.